Sunset Stories. I'm so happy you're here. Today we'll be reading Izzy The Indigo Fairy by Daisy Meadows. So I invite you to find somewhere cozy where you can relax as I read to you. A fairy tale beginning. Rain, rain, go away, Rachel Walker sighed. Come again another day. She and her friend Kirsty Tate stared out of the attic window. Raindrops splashed against the glass, and the sky was full of purpley black clouds. Isn't it a horrible day? Kirsty said. But it's nice and cozy in here. She looked round Rachel's small attic bedroom. There was just room for a brass bed with a patchwork quilt, a comfy armchair, and an old bookshelf. You know what the weather on Rainspell is like, Rachel pointed out. It might be hot and sunny very soon. Both girls had come to Rainspell Island on holiday. The Walkers were staying in Mermaid Cottage, while the Tates were in Dolphin Cottage next door. Kirsty frowned. Yes, but what about Izzy the Indigo Fairy? She asked. We have to find her today. Rachel and Kirsty shared a wonderful secret. They were trying to find the 7 rainbow fairies who had been cast out of Fairyland by evil Jack Frost. Fairyland would be cold and grey until all 7 fairies had been found again. Rachel thought of Ruby, Amber, Saffron, Fern and Sky, who were all safe now in the pot at the end of the rainbow. They only had Izzy the Indigo Fairy and Heather the Violet Fairy left to find. But how could they look for them while they were stuck indoors? Remember what the Fairy Queen said, she reminded Kirsty. Kirsty nodded. She said the magic would come to us. Suddenly she looked scared. Maybe the rain is Jack Frost's magic. Maybe he's trying to stop us finding Izzy. Oh no, Rachel said. Let's hope it stops soon. But what shall we do while we're waiting? Kirsty thought for a moment. Then she went over to the bookshelf. It was filled with dusty old books, and she pulled one out. It was so big she had to use 2 hands to hold it. The Big Book of Fairy Tales, Rachel read out loud, looking at the cover. If we can't find fairies, at least we can read about them, Kirsty grinned. The 2 girls sat down on the bed and put the book on their knees. Kirsty was about to turn the first page when Rachel gasped. Kirsty, look at the cover. It's purple. A really deep bluey purple. That's indigo, Kirsty whispered. Oh, Rachel, do you think Izzy could be trapped inside? Let's see, Rachel said. Hurry up, Kirsty, open the book. But Kirsty had spotted something else. Rachel, she said shakily, it's glowing. Rachel looked. Kirsty was right. Some pages in the middle of the book were gleaming with a soft, bluey purple light. Kirsty opened the book. The ink on the pages was glowing indigo. For a moment, Kirsty thought that Izzy might fly out of the pages, but there was no sign of her. On the first page was a picture of a wooden soldier. Above the picture were the words, "The Nutcracker." "Oh," Rachel said, "I know this story. I went to see the ballet at Christmas." "What's it about?" Kirsty asked. "Well, a girl called Clara gets a wooden nutcracker soldier for Christmas," Rachel explained. "He comes to life and takes her to the land of sweets." They looked down at a brightly coloured picture of a Christmas tree. A little girl was asleep beside it, holding a wooden soldier. On the next page there was a picture of snowflakes whirling and swirling through a dark forest. "Aren't the pictures great?" Kirsty said. "The snow looks so real." Rachel frowned. For a moment she thought the snowflakes were moving. She gently put out her hand and touched the page. It felt cold and wet. "Kirsty," she whispered, "it is real." She held out her hand. There were white snowflakes on her fingers. Kirsty looked down at the book again, her eyes wide. The snowflakes started to swirl from the book's pages right into the bedroom, slowly at first, then faster and faster. Soon the snowstorm was so thick Rachel and Kirsty couldn't see a thing, but they could feel themselves being swept up into the air by the spinning snow cloud. Rachel yelled to Kirsty, "Why haven't we hit the bedroom ceiling?" Kirsty reached for Rachel's hand. "Because it's magic," she whispered. The land of sweets. Suddenly, the snowflakes stopped swirling. Rachel and Kirsty found themselves standing in a forest with their rucksacks at their feet. Tall trees loomed around them, and crisp white snow covered the ground. They certainly weren't in Rachel's bedroom anymore. Then Rachel realised where they were. "Kirsty, this is the forest that was in the picture," she said, grabbing her friend's arm. "We're inside the book." Kirsty looked even more scared. "Do you think Jack Frost brought us here?" she asked. "Or his goblins?" Jack Frost's goblins were always trying to stop Rachel and Kirsty from finding the rainbow fairies. "I don't know," Rachel replied. Then she frowned. There was something odd about this snow. She bent down and gently touched a snowdrift. "This isn't snow," she laughed. "It's icing sugar." "What?" Kirsty looked amazed. She scooped up a handful and tasted it. The icing sugar was cool and sweet. "Maybe this isn't Jack Frost's magic after all," Rachel said. "I wonder where this forest is." "What's that?" Kirsty asked, pointing. Rachel could see a pink and gold glow through the trees. "Let's go and find out," she said. They picked up their rucksacks and set off. It was hard walking through the icing sugar. Soon their trainers were covered in the sugary snow. Crack! Rachel nearly jumped out of her skin as a loud noise echoed through the trees. "Sorry," said Kirsty. "I trod on a twig." "Wait," Rachel whispered. "I just heard voices." "Goblins," Kirsty whispered back, looking scared again. Rachel listened. The voices were louder now. She sighed with relief. No, they sound too sweet and soft to be goblins' voices. Rachel and Kirsty hurried towards the edge of the forest. When they came out of the trees, they saw that the glow was coming from a dazzling pink and gold archway. Look, Kirsty, Rachel gasped. It's made of sweets. Kirsty stared. The archway was made of pink marshmallows and golden toffees. Then they heard the voices again. They spun round to see who it was. Two people dressed in fluffy white coats were chatting to each other and scooping icing sugar into shiny metal buckets. They had round, rosy cheeks and little pointy ears. They were so busy they hadn't noticed Rachel and Kirsty yet. I think they're elves, Kirsty whispered, but they're the same size as we are. That means we must be fairy or at least elf-sized again. We haven't got any wings this time, though, Rachel whispered back. Suddenly, one of the elves spotted them. She looked very surprised. Hello, she called. Where did you come from? I'm Rachel, and this is Kirsty, Rachel explained. We came here through the forest. Where are we? Kirsty asked. This is the entrance to the land of sweets, said the first elf. My name is Wafer, and this is my sister, Cornet. We're the ice cream makers, added Cornet. What are you doing here? We're looking for Izzy the Indigo Fairy, Kirsty told them. Have you seen her? Both elves shook their heads. We've heard of the Rainbow Fairies, said Wafer, but Fairyland is far away from here, across the Lemonade Ocean. Maybe you should ask the Sugar Plum Fairy for help, Cornet suggested. She's so clever and kind. She'll know what to do. She lives on the other side of the village. Could you take us to her? Rachel asked eagerly. The elves nodded. Follow us, they said together, and they led Rachel and Kirsty through the archway of pink and gold sweets. On the other side of the arch, the sun shone down warmly from a bright blue sky. Flowers made of strawberry cream grew beneath milk chocolate trees. Squashy pink and white marshmallow houses lined the village street, which was paved with boiled sweets. Isn't this great? Kirsty laughed. It's like being inside a giant sweet shop. And it all looks yummy, Rachel agreed, spotting a garden gate made of stripy rock. There were elves hurrying everywhere. Some had shiny buckets like the ice cream makers, and others carried tiny silver hammers. There were gingerbread men too, looking very smart in their bright bow ties and currant buttons. Then a whole line of tiny wooden soldiers with polished black boots marched across the street in front of them, and Rachel spotted a glistening pink sugar mouse scurrying between their feet. Kirsty and Rachel smiled at each other with delight. The two elves led Rachel and Kirsty down the street. Suddenly, a cross-looking gingerbread man hurried out of one of the houses and bumped into Cornet. Hello, Buttons, Wafer said. You're in a hurry? What's the matter? Cornet asked. You look upset. The gingerbread man held out his hand. Look at my best bow tie, he said. It was red when I hung it out to dry on my washing line, and now it's this colour. Rachel and Kirsty gasped. The bow tie was bluey purple. Izzy, they both said together. The ice cream elves looked puzzled. I think this means that Izzy the Indigo Fairy is close by, Rachel explained. We'd better help you find her before she gets into any more trouble, Cornet said. Then she frowned as a small boy elf ran towards them. He had one hand clapped over his mouth and he was laughing. "Scoop," called Wafer. She turned to Rachel and Kirsty. "He's our little brother," she explained. "Scoop, what are you giggling about?" Still laughing, Scoop took his hand away from his mouth. Rachel and Kirsty stared. The little elf's mouth was stained indigo. "What happened?" gasped Cornet. "I had a drink from the lemonade fountain," Scoop said between giggles. "All the lemonades turned bluey purple. It made my tongue tingle too." "That sounds like more rainbow fairy magic," Kirsty said. "Where's the lemonade fountain?" Rachel asked the elves. "In the village square," replied Cornet, "just round the corner." "Thanks for your help," said Kirsty. She grabbed Rachel's hand and they ran off. As soon as Rachel and Kirsty rounded the corner, they skidded to a halt. In the middle of the village square was a pretty fountain. Bright bluey purple liquid bubbled up from a fountain shaped like a dolphin. A crowd of elves, soldiers, and gingerbread men stood round the fountain, all talking at once. They sounded cross. A polka-dotted Jack-in-the-Box bounced back and forth with a grumpy look on his face. A swirl of indigo fairy dust shot up from the middle of the crowd. As the dust fell to the ground, it changed into dewberry-scented ink drops. Rachel and Kirsty stared at each other in delight. They knew what fairy dust meant. They had found another rainbow fairy. "Look out!" "Izzy," Rachel called as she and Kirsty pushed their way through the crowd. "Is that you?" "Who's that?" called a cheeky tinkling voice. Izzy was standing by the edge of the lemonade fountain. She had neat blue-black hair and twinkling dark blue eyes. She was dressed in indigo denim jeans and a matching jacket covered with spangly patches. Ink drop-shaped silver earrings hung in her ears, and her wand was indigo tipped with silver. The fairy stared at Rachel and Kirsty with her hands on her hips. "Who are you?" she asked, "and how do you know my name?" "I'm Kirsty, and this is Rachel," Kirsty explained. "We've come to take you back to your rainbow sisters." "We've found 5 of your sisters so far," Rachel added. "We're going to help you all go home to fairyland." "That's brilliant news," Izzy cried. "I've been so worried." "How did you get to the land of sweets?" Kirsty asked. "The wind blew me down the chimney of Mermaid Cottage and into the story of the Nutcracker," Izzy replied. "I've been in the land of sweets ever since. I can't go back to fairyland and break Jack Frost's spell without my sisters. I have to get back to Rainspell Island first." Before Rachel and Kirsty could say anything else, the crowd started shouting again. "Look what she's done to the lemonade fountain," grumbled one elf. Izzy grinned at him. "I didn't mean to," she said. "The lemonade looks so yummy I just had to have a drink, and that's when it turned indigo." "And what about my bow tie?" snapped Buttons. He had followed Rachel and Kirsty to the fountain. "I was really tired after walking out of the forest," Izzy explained. "I borrowed your lovely bow tie to wrap around me while I had a little nap." The crowd started to mutter crossly again. Quickly, Rachel stepped forward. "Wait," she said. "Have you heard about the rainbow fairies and Jack Frost's spell?" The crowd listened as Rachel told them the whole story. When she'd finished, they didn't look so cross anymore. "I'm so sorry for all the trouble I've caused," Izzy said. "Please, can you tell us how to get back to Rainspell Island?" The The Sugar Plum Fairy will help you, said the Jack-in-the-Box with a little bounce. Her home is just past the jelly bean fields. That's where we were going, Kirsty said. Come on then, Izzy cried. She darted forward and took Rachel and Kirsty by the hand. Good luck, called everyone. Rachel and Kirsty walked along the road towards the jelly bean fields, with Izzy darting eagerly ahead of them. Just outside the village was a huge rock of golden toffee, as tall as a marshmallow house. Elves were tapping the rock with little hammers to break pieces off the toffee. Other elves picked them up and put them into silver buckets. Kirsty nudged Rachel. That looks like hard work, she said. They don't seem to be collecting much toffee at all. Rachel peeped into one of the buckets as an elf walked past. Kirsty was right. There were only a few chips of toffee in it. Is there something wrong with the toffee? Izzy wondered. The elf with the bucket overheard her. It's really hard today, he grumbled. Anyone would think it had been frozen. Frozen, Kirsty said in alarm. Do you think that means Jack Frost's goblins are here in the land of sweets? Whenever the goblins were close by, they brought frost and icy weather. Izzy looked scared. I hope not, she said. Just then, a loud rumbling noise and a shout of "Look out!" made them all jump. An enormous wooden barrel was rolling down the street straight towards them, and running behind it were two goblins, grinning all over their ugly faces. Stop those goblins. We've got you now, Izzy, shouted one of the goblins. For a moment everyone froze. Then Izzy leaped into action and gave Rachel and Kirsty a push. Quick, get out of the way, she yelled. They jumped aside just in time. The elves dropped their hammers and their buckets. They dashed out of the way, bumping into each other in their panic. Crash! The barrel smashed right into the toffee mountain. Then it burst open. Lemon sherbet spilled out in a sticky yellow cloud. Izzy, Kirsty, Rachel coughed, peering through the sherbet. Are you all right? I think so, achoo, Kirsty sneezed. Help! Kirsty heard Izzy's frightened voice, but she couldn't see her through the sherbet cloud. Help! Izzy shouted again. The goblins have got me. Her voice was getting fainter. Quick, Rachel, have you got our magic bags? Still coughing, Rachel swung her rucksack off her back. Tatiana, the fairy queen, had given the girls bags full of magic gifts to help them rescue the missing rainbow fairies. Rachel opened her rucksack. Inside it, one of the magic bags was glowing faintly silver. Rachel pulled out a folded paper fan from the bag. Puzzled, she opened the fan up. It was coloured like the most beautiful rainbow, with stripes of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. Rachel thought for a moment. Then she began to flap the fan at the clouds of sherbet. Whoosh! A blast of air from the fan blew almost all of the sherbet away. Wow, this fan is amazing, Rachel gasped as the last of the sherbet drifted off. Look, Rachel, shouted Kirsty. They're over there. The goblins had tied Izzy's trainers together with strawberry bootlaces. They were half dragging, half carrying her up the road towards the jelly bean fields. We've got to save her, Rachel said, quickly folding the fan and putting it in her pocket. Come on, Kirsty. I'll go and tell the Sugar Plum Fairy, said one of the elves, and he dashed off. Rachel and Kirsty ran up the road. The goblins had got a head start, but Izzy was wriggling so much that she was slowing them down. The road led through the jellybean fields. Tall green plants stood in rows, each one covered with different coloured beans. Pink, white, blue spotted and chocolate brown ones. Elves were picking the jelly beans and putting them into big baskets. Suddenly, Rachel noticed that the goblins were looking greedily at the jelly beans. One of them had skidded to a halt. He leaned over the fence and grabbed a big handful of beans from the nearest plant. The other goblin did the same. "Yummy," said the first goblin, stuffing the beans into his mouth. "They're so greedy," Rachel panted. "Yes, but it gives us a chance of catching them up," Kirsty puffed. She started to run even faster. The elves working in the field shouted angrily at the goblins, but that didn't stop them. They gobbled down one bean after another, picking beans with one hand and holding on to Izzy with the other. "I've got an idea," Rachel whispered to Kirsty. At the side of the road she could see some baskets full of beans which had already been picked. She hurried over and lifted up a basket. Then she held it out towards the goblins. "Look what I've got," she called. "A whole basket full of beans." A very suitable punishment. The goblins' eyes lit up when they saw the basket. Izzy grinned and winked at Kirsty and Rachel. She'd guessed what they were doing. "Those jelly beans look yummy," Izzy said to the goblins. "I wish I could have one." "Be quiet," snapped the goblin with the bigger nose. He turned to the other goblin. "You keep hold of the fairy while I get the beans." "No," said the other one. "You'll eat all the beans. You hold the fairy and I'll get the beans." "No," roared the first goblin. "Then you'll eat all the beans." Glaring at each other, both goblins let go of Izzy and ran towards Rachel. She quickly threw a handful of beans on the ground and backed away. The goblins bent down to grab the beans. When they stood up again, Rachel threw another handful back down the hill, away from Izzy. Those greedy goblins just couldn't resist the yummy beans. While the goblins were busy stuffing themselves, Kirsty rushed over to untie Izzy. "Are you all right?" she asked. Izzy nodded and wriggled her feet. "Thank you." Rachel put the basket on the ground and ran over to Kirsty and Izzy. The goblins pounced on the basket and began squabbling over the rest of the beans. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said. Suddenly there was a gentle flapping noise overhead. Rachel looked up to see a huge butterfly with pink and gold wings fluttering above them. On its back sat a fairy with long red hair. The butterfly landed gently on the ground. The fairy climbed off the butterfly's back and smiled at Izzy and the girls. She wore a long green and gold dress and a tiara. "Welcome," she said. "I am the Sugar Plum Fairy." She looked sternly at the goblins who were crouching beside the empty bean basket. "What are you doing in the land of sweets?" she demanded. The goblins didn't answer. They were too busy groaning and holding their tummies. "Oh," moaned the one with the big nose, "my tummy hurts." "Mine too," whined the other one. "I feel sick." "They've eaten too many jelly beans." Izzy grinned at Rachel and Kirsty. The Sugar Plum Fairy looked even crosser. "As you have stolen so many of our delicious jelly beans," she said to the goblins, "you must be taught a lesson." "Why don't you make them pick jelly beans?" Izzy suggested. What a good idea, smiled the Sugar Plum Fairy. That doesn't seem like a very bad punishment, Kirsty whispered to Rachel. But just look at the goblins' faces, Rachel whispered back. The goblins looked horrified at the thought of more jelly beans. They tried to get up as if they wanted to run away, but the Sugar Plum Fairy waved her hand and several elves came running out of the jelly bean fields. They marched the goblins into the nearest field and handed them empty baskets. With sulky faces, the goblins started to pick the beans. Serves them right, laughed Izzy. Then she looked worried again. But I still need to get back to my rainbow sisters. Please, can you help us get back to Rainspell Island? Rachel asked the Sugar Plum Fairy. The beautiful fairy nodded. We will send you home by balloon, she said. She waved her wand at the empty bean basket. Rachel and Kirsty watched in amazement as it grew bigger and bigger. There is your basket. But where's the balloon? Said Rachel. The Sugar Plum Fairy pointed to a tall tree covered with pink blossoms. What pretty flowers, Kirsty said. Then she took a closer look and began to laugh. They're not flowers, they're pieces of bubble gum. How is that going to help? Rachel felt puzzled. Izzy grinned at them, her eyes sparkling mischievously. Leave it to me, she said. She pulled one of the bubblegum flowers off the tree, popped it into her mouth and began to chew. Then, screwing up her face, she blew a huge pink bubblegum bubble. She puffed and puffed, and the bubble grew bigger and bigger. Soon it towered above them. It was the biggest bubblegum bubble Rachel and Kirsty had ever seen. Izzy took the bubble out of her mouth and tied a knot in the end. The perfect balloon, she said. Now we're ready to go. Rachel and Kirsty grinned at each other. What a brilliant way to travel back to Rainspell. The elves working in the jelly bean fields and the elves who had followed Rachel and Kirsty out of the village helped to tie the bubblegum balloon to the basket. Then Rachel, Kirsty and Izzy climbed inside. The Sugar Plum Fairy waved her wand at the balloon, showering it with gold sparkles. The balloon will take you to Rainspell Island, she explained. Goodbye and good luck. Thank you, called Rachel and Izzy, but Kirsty was looking round in dismay. There's no wind, she said. We won't be able to get off the ground. The bubblegum balloon. Rachel looked at the leaves on the bubblegum tree. Kirsty was right. They weren't moving at all. The Sugar Plum Fairy smiled. Rachel, don't you remember what you have in your pocket? She said. Of course, Rachel exclaimed. The magic fan. She took it out of her pocket and unfolded it. Then she flapped it under the balloon. Whoosh! The blast of air lifted the balloon up into the sky. Goodbye, Kirsty called, waving at the Sugar Plum Fairy and all the elves. Thank you for all your help, Izzy called. Sorry I made such a mess, she added with a giggle. The balloon bobbed slowly upwards. As it got higher, the wind became stronger, so Rachel put away her fan. Big, puffy clouds began swirling around the balloon. We'll be home soon, Rachel said, trying to sound cheerful. The wind roared around them, rocking the basket from side to side. Rachel, Kirsty and Izzy hung on to each other. Then, all of a sudden, the wind dropped. The balloon stopped swaying. The air felt warm. Kirsty opened her eyes. We're home, she gasped. They were back in Rachel's attic bedroom at Mermaid Cottage. The balloon and the basket had vanished. The book of fairy tales was lying on the floor, open at the nutcracker. "But where's Izzy?" Rachel said. "I'm here," said a cheeky voice. The Indigo Fairy popped up from Rachel's pocket. She wriggled out and fluttered into the air, her wings sparkling with rainbows and showering the room with fairy dust ink drops. The smell of dewberries drifted up as they popped. Kirsty picked up the book. She turned the pages until she found a picture of the land of sweets. "It's a shame we didn't get to taste any of those lovely sweets," she said. As she spoke, a tiny puff of icing sugar floated out of the book. Then a shower of different coloured jelly beans fell onto Rachel's bed. "They must be a present from the Sugar Plum Fairy," laughed Izzy. Rachel and Kirsty each popped a jelly bean into their mouths. They were tiny, but they tasted lovely. "Yum," said Izzy, munching a bean. "Can we take some back to the pot for my sisters?" Rachel nodded. "Let's go right away," she said, filling her pockets with beans. "Your sisters will be waiting for you." She looked at Kirsty and smiled. They had rescued another fairy and escaped the goblins once again. They'd even been inside a fairy story in a book, and now there was only one more fairy to find. And that's that. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any recommendations for stories you would like me to read, do put them in the comments below. I always love hearing from you. And in the meantime, until our next